Okay, so Dr. Basu has finally joined the call. Dr. Basu is a Harvard postdoctoral research fellow who does research on basic science, and she'll be explaining clinical research and epidemiology today to us. So if you're ready, feel free to present your slides or whatever you've prepared.
Hi everyone, it's wonderful meeting you all. I am, like Josna introduced, I am a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Medical School, and I do research on uh, yeast genetics and biochemistry. I have a keen interest in teaching, and that's the reason why I was invited here today to speak about uh, one of the modules I have developed for a course for to introduce to recruit minorities to research. I have a huge interest in designing courses that STEM courses, of course, that help recruit minorities in research. And my target audience is typically high school students or freshman students. So one of the modules I developed was on clinical research and epidemiology, and that's the topic that I would talk about today. So although I am not a clinical scientist, I think as aspiring scientists, you all should have some introductory exposure towards epidemiology and clinical research, especially since you have lived. Oh, you can't see my face. Since you are living through a pandemic, it's very important for you to be introduced to clinical research and epidemiology, especially if you guys have interest in public health, being public health experts or infectious disease experts. So the talk today will be mainly very, very fundamental, just what's what of clinical research and epidemiology. And epidemiology is a favorite topic of mine, primarily because I'm really interested in crime thrillers. I love playing the detective, and I feel like as epidemiologists, you can play detectives. You're like the detective who kind of catches and tracks diseases. And today, I think I would explain you the very first example of epidemiology. It's a classic example that was, and it's like a detective story where you will play the detectives, and I will give you some clues and track and we'll explore the earliest well recorded example of a human a disease in a societal context and how they tracked it. So that's how we'll end the session. Feel free to interrupt me at any point, and I want this to be more of a discussion session because I tend to fall asleep when I'm just lecturing and my students are not sharing anything back. All right, so we'll begin with clinical research. All right, so like I said, this is a very general introduction to clinical research and epidemiology. So first, let's look at some definitions. So when we talk about, so there will be two major sections, clinical research and epidemiology. And under clinical research, we'll go through some definitions, why it's important to do clinical research, different types of trials, different phases of a trial, stakeholders in a clinical trial, and workflow of clinical trial. Now, the most recent clinical trial you must have followed over the news is, of course, the COVID-19 trials. And so when you listen to this framework, try to relate it with the COVID-19 trial, and I'll make the appropriate references. So how the FDA and the NIH defines a clinical trial: it is a research in which people, data, or samples samples of tissues, human tissues, are studied to understand health and disease. It helps us find new ways to detect, diagnose, prevent diseases, and they can be clinical research. Types of clinical research include clinical trial, which tests for new diseases, studies the natural history of diseases, and collects public health information to track how a disease progresses, declines, or even peaks during some time. It is let me reiterate this, a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions. And this intervention can be a control, which is typically called placebo, or it can be the actual medicine. So in the COVID-19 trials, if we studied, say, 100 people, some of them were given sugar water or placebo, and some of them received the actual vaccine. The aim here being we want to study apples to apples. We want to study that if we see any change in the patient population, it is due to this drug and not a random effect. So you have to have these controls. So, and this is done to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health related or biomedical or behavioral outcomes. Now, why it is important to do clinical research? It helps us discover new treatments for diseases, new ways of detection, diagnosis, and reduction in the changes of developing disease. For instance, you can cervical cancer screening is a classic example of reducing the chance of developing a disease. You can help typical cancer screenings can help detect in the early detection of diseases, which can help improve outcome and your chances of survival for that particular diseases. It helps improve patient outcome. It helps bring new drugs to the market. For instance, the various vaccines for COVID-19, or even new drugs for already existing diseases, like new therapies for treating lung cancer and breast cancer, etc. So the disease might already have been there for some time, or it might be a new emerging threat like the coronavirus or various other viral outbreaks that we have. It also helps us improve quality of care, how to treat. We say we already know existing ways of treating a disease, but we can always build upon that, improve that. So clinical research helps us do that kind of things. So when we think of clinical trials, they are really huge experiments, and they can be they can consist of various kinds, and some of the kinds are treatment research. For instance, a classic example is cancer research. A patient has some sort of cancer, and you provide an intervention through some sort of radiation therapy, surgery, etc. It's a treatment research. You're very familiar with this kind of thing. Prevention research. You take some measures to prevent progression to some disease. It can be, say, you add vitamins to your diet to prevent XYZ disease. You make lifestyle changes to prevent, say, obesity. Those sorts of things are prevention research. Diagnostic research, this is looking for better ways to identify a particular disorder. For instance, we are always improving methods to, say, detection of cervical cancer, right? So that can be diagnostic research. Screening research, again, this can be a little overlapping here. You develop new and novel ways, cheaper ways, more economic ways to detect diseases. So diagnostic and screening can be a little overlapping. Quality of life research, so it's something if you have chronic back pain, and we are always looking for methods to improve quality of life for those people, quality of life research. And then there can be genetic studies, and this can aim to improve our ability to predict disorders by identifying how genes are directly or indirectly correlated to diseases, and if having a certain genetic marker, having certain genes make you predisposed to developing certain conditions. That's like genetic studies. And finally, epidemiological studies, which we will cover in greater details later. This is really, like I said, playing detectives to identify the pattern of how diseases spread, how diseases are caused, how we can control them, what factors trigger them or trigger their spread, if some populations are more vulnerable to some diseases, if some populations are naturally more resilient to diseases. All these studies are under epidemiological studies. All right, so these are some of the different types of clinical trials that there is. Generally, all clinical trials overall are categorized into one or more of these categories. This is the from the NIH website. This is the different phases of a clinical trial, and if you have been following the development of the COVID vaccines, you might be a little familiar with this phase. So I'm just going to quickly go over this. So there's the preclinical phase, and this preclinical phase can be decades for different diseases. For the coronavirus vaccine, although we developed the vaccine in 1 to 2 years, less than 2 years, remember this preclinical phase was even there before the disease, because we were studying how viruses and how viruses affect the host, and we were doing basic mRNA research for decades, right? And a lot of that information, a lot of the progress we made doing that kind of basic research propelled our understanding of how viruses enter the host, affect the host, hijack the host machinery, etc. So the preclinical phase can essentially be decades, and a lot of it is from basic research and, of course, translational research. So the second phase is, and the preclinical phase is also testing it on animals. You can have rodents, or you can test it on mouse or any sort of animal model, and that's also included in your preclinical phase. Once you have a green signal in those phases, once you think that, okay, this drug seems to work, you go into phase 1, which is 20 to 80 participants, which is a very, very small study, right? And in the phase 2, you step it up a little bit, around 100 to 300 participants. Now, then there's phase 3, and 1, 2, 3 are kind of connected, where there is 1,000 to 3,000 participants. Now, so where do the participants come from, right? So for the coronavirus vaccine trial, the participants were a huge section of these participants were volunteers. People actually volunteered to get infected by the virus, and then they volunteered to be treated with the vaccine, right? And these were that's a great service to the society and science. And these volunteers were studied. They were either given placebo or given the vaccine, and then or given the vaccine and then given the virus, and then they were studied what effects they had. Did the various interventions matter, etc. So that's phase 1 to 3. This can also be, so say in a cancer trial, this can also be actual patients who volunteer to enroll themselves in this sort of a clinical study. Now remember, if you are a patient enrolling in this sort of a study, of course you have to be told about the risks here. And we have a whole bunch of protocols, IRB protocols, that are meant to look after the welfare and look after the rights of these patients. And that's mainly the phase 1, 2, 3. That's how phases 1, 2, 3 work. Now, these phases are very closely monitored. Remember, so you have read in the news outlets that this administration of this coronavirus vaccine was halted, right, a couple of times because people develop blood clots and other syndromes, right? So remember, the vaccine is a little exceptional because it's very fast tracked. Generally, we don't have drugs approved this fast, right? We have to study them for a certain time before it's in the market. So if the FDA or other authorities find out that this drug, there are considerable concerns here about this drug, they will stop the trial. and it's in phase 1 to 3 that they can very easily stop this trial. However, if certain intervention survives these 3 phases, we kind of get the drug approved, and then we do an FDA review to confirm safety and effectiveness. And once the drug is approved, it has kind of crossed that threshold of being an experimental drug. So now it's approved. It goes to phase 4, which is when we have like thousands and thousands of people being given the drug. And this is how drugs get to the market. This can be very short, like the coronavirus vaccine, which was a little over a year or 1.5 years. Or it can be, again, it can take 10 or 20 years, like it can be decades. So the timeline here is extremely variable. All right, so these are the various phases of a clinical trial. And who are the people involved in a clinical trial? When I say clinical trial, who are the players? Number one are the participants. These are the people receiving at the receiving end of the clinical trial. They are the people who are receiving an intervention, receiving a vaccine, receiving any sort of medicine, drug, any sort of advice. It can even be advice. So these are the patients. Funders and sponsors, the National Institute of Health, private funders like the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society. These are the funders and sponsors of the National Science Foundation. These are the people who actually fund these studies, right? So second, regulatory agencies. Again, this can be the NIH, then the FDA, the NSF, who are keeping an eye on the fairness of the trial, if all the checks and balances are in place, if all the protocols are being followed, etc. So these are the regulatory agencies. Investigators, scientists, doctors who are actually doing these experiments, running this trial, keeping a track of the data. These are our investigators. Research institutions and universities. Of course, clinical trials are usually under huge hospitals or institutions, and these are the big players here. Journals where you publish, you find something, you find that this vaccine works, you find that this cancer drug actually works. Where do you publish it? You have to put it out to the community. You have to let other people know that, oh, this is what we found. So journals are where you publish. Journals are where your findings come out. And of course, professional societies like the all the scientific societies that we have, that actually where we present and where we present our data, share our data with the broader audience. So here are some of the broadly some of the participants that play a major role. These are the major players in any clinical trial that you will conduct. All right, to end this section, this is just a very rough workflow of how clinical trials go. So of course you have to plan the clinical trial. So I want to see if this drug can treat stage 4 melanoma. We have to get the protocol approved, meaning I have to say, oh, I'm going to study, say, 100 patients. This is going to be my control. This is going to be my experiment. I'm going to inform these patients of the risks of the trial, side effects of the trial. I'm going to follow up these patients in this way. So that's your protocol. You have to get it approved by the respective agencies. Select and approve investigator. The investigators have to have a credibility. They have to submit their plan clearly, like this is exactly what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to do to protect the identity of the subjects, to protect their rights during the trial, etc. Select patients. Who are you going to select patients? Are you going to select patients who are only male? Are you going to, if this is a breast cancer study, if your patients are all female, what is the age group? Are you studying people 20 to 30 years old? Are you studying patients 30 to 40 years old? What is your age group? So you have to define your age group, and that's selection of the patients. It can be stage 1 breast cancer patients, stage 2 breast cancer patients, etc. Initiate study, which means you have to start the study. data collection and review. So this is your experiment. Initiate, study, and data collection and review is your experiment. You're actually, you have now your cohort of patients, and now what you're doing is you are actually doing your experiment, actually giving these people a drug, an intervention, advice, anything. And then you're following up with the patients that, oh, this is how it's affected. That's your data collection and review. Statistical analysis. So you do find that, oh, this drug does produce XYZ effect on my patients. Is this statistically relevant? Is this really a change? So that's your statistical analysis. Critical part of any clinical research. You have a lot of subjects to study. Is this data even relevant? Write report. This is mainly writing your publications, writing it up for a conference, etc. And data submission and approval. This is the final stage where you actually publish your result or submit it to the FDA or other authorities to actually let the community know about your research and kind of put it out there that this was what we found testing XYZ drug on these patients and this was the outcome. So this is the whole experiment of a clinical trial. You start from beginning to end. Again, it can last you decades, right? And it can be a smaller study where your patients are in the hundreds, or it can be a massive study where you have millions of patients, right? So this is the outcome of this is the first section that I wanted to talk about. Clinical research or clinical trials. And before we move on to epidemiology, do you guys have any questions?
No, it sounds good. It was really interesting.
All right. So next we move into epidemiology. I feel I can never say it right. All right. So it's a big word, I feel. So what does that mean? What does the word mean? Do you guys have any idea? Feel free to speak up.
So I don't have any idea right now, but like it might be some about epidemics, since it starts with epidemic.
All right, so the first answer we have, it's something to do with epidemics because it sounds similar to epidemiology. Anyone else?
Someone in the chat said study of disease control.
Second answer we have is study of disease control. All right.
Another said study about epidemic, and another says diseases spread in multiple countries.
Diseases. All right. Anything else?
The study and origin of a certain disease or virus.
All right. Study or origin of a certain disease, of a virus-related disease. All right. Well, it's a little bit of all of these. All of you are right in certain aspects. Let me give you the broader picture here. So epi means on or upon. So whenever you have a big word in science, always break it up. That's my advice. Then it helps you remember where it comes from. So epi means on or upon. Demio means people. And logy is the study of. Right? So on or upon, people, and the study of. So epidemiology means it's the study of what falls upon a population. This can be anything. It can be an epidemic. It can be a disease of bacterial origin like cholera. It can be disease of a virus outbreak like the coronavirus, the monkeypox virus, the bird flu. It can be anything. So this is a broad definition that practically covers all of the things that you guys mentioned. It's the study of anything that falls upon a population. Now remember, this can be I know you guys are very inclined to think about viral outbreaks now in the pandemic, but this can be a lot of things, and I have a picture to show you what it can cover. So, in this section, we are going to cover the definition of epidemiology, why it is important, types of epidemiological studies, workflow, and we're going to end with the classic epidemiological study where you guys are going to track a disease. So, first things first, definition. It is are conducted using human populations to evaluate where there is a causal relationship between exposure to a substance and adverse health effects. So what is exposure to a substance? It can be a virus, it can be a bacteria, it can be various environmental factors, it can be even a pollutant that you're exposed to. It can be any of these things. So this is a very broad definition, and it is also, it compares the risk of developing a disease. A man and a woman who has been exposed to the coronavirus, will they develop coronavirus symptoms at the same time? Will they develop it at all? Is there a difference between their propensity of developing a disease? All these studies. Will the age matter, right? Will status like pregnancy matter? Will it matter if they're immunocompromised? Will it matter if they have cancer, right? All these correlations come under the broad idea of epidemiology. Here are 4 pictures. These, I want to impress upon you the wide range of things that can be under epidemiology. Can someone you can pick any of the pictures and explain to me how that is an epidemiological study? What is as scientists, you have to identify the question, right? So what is the question? What is the question of the epidemiological study that I'm showing you here? You can pick any picture and just go ahead. Just go ahead and don't have to type in, just say it.
The one with the water may be how contaminants might get into the water and affect an individual's organs, for example.
All right, quick follow-up question. Why did the water get polluted in the first place?
Maybe because of substances that surround the water, or how it flows through, what substances flows through might penetrate through the water molecules, for example.
Think again. You're absolutely on track about the water being contaminated, but how did the water get contaminated in this picture?
Oh, I'm talking about the one with the pipe.
The pipe. Oh. So okay, absolutely right. So here I am. Yes, so she's absolutely right. So here I have a water pipe, and what I'm studying is the levels of heavy metals and how that can lead up to a disease. Can you guys think of an example for this? It has been in the news in the past 10 years maybe.
Lead poisoning, maybe?
Flint, Michigan. Yes, the tap water has heavy metals, like, so Flint, Michigan was in the news for having contaminated water. So this is a very good example of picture 1. All right, picture 2, 3, 4.
I think the one with the berries is like how the things that a person eats affect their health.
Yes, picture 2 is often you see on the news that 3 tons of lettuce was recalled from these stores for having salmonella contamination, right? You read it all the time. That kind of thing. So they are able to track that these supermarkets had these kinds of food contaminated. So it's like essentially a foodborne pathogen that's spreading. So it's that kind of epidemiological study. All right, the last 2.
The bottom right could be about how air pollution affects your health.
So picture 4.
Yeah.
Yes. So picture 4 is, it can cover actually a lot of things. It is essentially environmental pollutants, but this could be due to either war, the area has been at war, and there are certain chemicals that has been introduced in the environment, land, the soil, the air, water, everything. This could also be a nuclear event. You guys know that after the nuclear bomb in Hiroshima, the area was the land, the air, the water sources were contaminated. So this is essentially contamination introduced due to a major event like a war, nuclear explosion, even nuclear leaks, chemical leaks from factories, something like that, that can contaminate soil, air, or water. So this is one thing. It can also be not so it can be a major event, like something that happened in a day or in a year. It can also be consistent leaks from factories, which might have happened undetected for some time. So that is also under this category. And so this is that. And the third picture is what? What do you think the third picture is?
I think the third picture could be either water or both water and land pollution, due to probably not enough space to dispose our garbage.
All right, that is indeed a very good area of study. But what the third picture is the aftermath of a hurricane. It's a natural disaster. You can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer. Yes, laser pointer. Can you see the car in the water? That kind of gives you a clue that it kind of flew off, or like the water got in the land. Or this is like a hurricane. This is a major natural disaster that happened. And what would happen is water or water from the lakes or etc. will flood into the land, and the water gets contaminated. It's a major source of bacteria, of having contaminated water, and this can lead to diseases. If you followed the cyclone in Haiti, this is what happened, and this is very common when a disaster strikes. So this can also be under epidemiological study. So as you can see, it can be your everyday food, right from your everyday food to having a nuclear explosion. It's a huge range of events that gives rise to an epidemiological study. All right, so some of the questions you can possibly ask are, I have started with very simple, does smoking cause cancer? One of the earliest epidemiological studies we had. What are the causes of higher rates of pancreatic cancer in certain population? Why do some people have more pancreatic cancer than others? Does coronavirus affect males and females disproportionately? Are women who are pregnant more prone to getting heart attacks? This is like a sample platter of a wide variety of questions that you can ask if you are an epidemiologist. Why is it important? Why do we care? Of course, like some of you guys already says, it helps us identify the distribution of diseases. It helps us identify what's causing the disease. How did the disease spread? It might not be obvious. Like if you have a hurricane, it might be very obvious. But if you have had a factory leak for 10 years, you might not have detected it. So it might not be obvious. And the example we will explore, it's not superbly obvious. Disease surveillance. So the same disease can go up and down in different parts of the world, right? Right now, some parts of the world are seeing a resurgence of coronavirus, right? Other parts have it more under control. So we study the different patterns here. Outbreak investigation. If you have a disease, say some contamination from food in a certain area, it's sudden outbreak, you investigate that. And finally, and there are also observational study to identify risk factor of diseases. For instance, people who smoke will develop lung cancer. Is that true? So you want to conduct that kind of a study. So these are some of the various things that you can study under epidemiology. It's a huge spectrum. The workflow is rather similar to, in some aspects, to a clinical study. You identify the question. In this case, my question is, say, I'm studying the correlation between smoking and developing lung cancer. That's my question. You have to select a study type. What kind of study is this? What kind of epidemiological study is it? Of course, do the experiment, choose your patients, collect data, statistical analysis, and review all your data. Interpretation of results. Is this even significant? Is this intervention or is this correlation true? Does lung cancer really increased in cigarette smokers, that kind of thing? And finally, report results. Whoever funded your studies, to the general audience, to the government, you'd say, oh, this is what we found. So this is roughly a workflow of an epidemiological study. All right, any questions before we move into the case? All right, so the example we will go through is, you might have heard of this example. It's a very famous example of the first well-recorded, one of the earliest well-recorded cases of an epidemiological study. So the story starts in a neighborhood in London, Soho, and in the 1850s, around 1850s, England was plagued with cholera. Anyone knows what cholera is? Have you ever heard of the symptoms? Have you ever heard what causes it? Is it really serious?
Is it caused by contaminated water supply?
Yes. One of the major reasons of cholera is contamination of drinking water. The water you drink gets contaminated. So this is 1850, so remember, you should put yourself in a time frame where you have no idea, no clear idea about microorganisms, right? We don't know what causes diseases in the molecular level, right? So this is 1854, and from 1831 to 1854, London had this, thousands of people died because of this disease called cholera, and nobody knows where it's coming from. So we don't know where it's coming from. Water. People are just dying, and you know, in those days with poor understanding of disease, what was blamed was anything between divine intervention, bad behavior. It was completely random. So what's happening is, essentially in this 15, 20 years, people are dying, and it's cholera, but nobody knows how it is spread, nobody knows how to prevent it, nobody knows what triggers it, and what are the measures that the city should take. So this is your problem. This is your disease that you have to track. Now, so we have a protagonist in every story. So our protagonist is someone called Dr. Jon Snow, who looks like this and not this, for those of you who watch too much of Game of Thrones. So Jon Snow was an English physician. Curiously, what his life's work mainly is really developing anesthesia during childbirth, and he's considered one of the founders of modern epidemiology. So Jon Snow is our hero, and just to put in context what cholera is, for those of you not familiar, it's a disease of, it's basically affects your intestines, and you will have you can have mild to very severe symptoms, vomiting or diarrhea. However, it can be mild to just being vomiting or diarrhea, or it can be really serious and you can die within hours from the onset of the disease, and it's an intestinal disease. At that point, we had no idea what it's caused by. Now, what causes it, but now we know. Here are some of the pictures from the 1800s, the 1700s, that kind of tells you how it was perceived. It is like this giant monster that kind of comes and attacks a population, and they have no idea what's causing it. So the misinformation was really high in those ages. So just to give you a context, in London at that time, the River Thames was a major source of water, and of course they had hand pumps that people could use to get their daily supply of water. And here are some of the facts. So when the disease, so you are like an investigator and you reach 1850s London, the first questions you would ask are, what are the facts here? How has the disease spread? How many people have been affected, etc., right? So let me give you the facts. So there is no running water. There are no modern toilets. This is 1850. So there are community resources for water, like town wells, communal pumps. So everything is common. You don't have your private supply. There is no modern sanitation, right? So you have untreated sewage and you have animal waste that goes directly into the River Thames, and you have cesspools, which are essentially pits where you dump your waste, right? Not very hygienic, right? Yes. And in August 50, so what triggered John Snow's investigation was a major event in August 1854, where 500 people died within 10 days. And the area was 250 yards of the Broad Street pump. In the Soho area, there is like a street called Broad Street. You can still see this, by the way. It is actually, they have, I think the pump is kind of labeled if you visit Soho, just because it's so important in the history of our understanding of disease. So what triggered this is 500 people die within 10 days, and this is confined in this area of Broad Street, and this is within 250 yards of the Broad Street pump. So here are your clues, right? Now, so you have just reached Broad Street. I have given you the facts, which are here. Now I have 3 questions for you. Start thinking. 3 questions. Number 1, if you were Jon Snow, you are the investigation who has been sent, what would you do? Where do you start? Do you ask people questions? What sort of questions? What do you investigate? How are you thinking here? That's my first question. Second question is, all right, let's go question by question. So first question, you are at the scene. Where would you start? You know the information.
I would probably go collect some water from the pump to see if there's any obvious signs of contamination, like discoloration or substances in the water. So that would give an obvious clue that, oh, there's something in the water that's causing this.
Right. If you have modern techniques available, the first thing you would do is definitely test the water, right? Identify the source of contamination, and that's what we do these days. We test the water. Are there heavy metals, as in flint, which causes other kinds of disease? But in this case, since it's cholera, we would obviously look for pathogens. But in 1850s, this might be a little bit of a problem because you have no clear idea of microorganisms or pathogens, right? But yes, in today's age, we would obviously do that, collect a water sample. All right, what else?
So you said that
everything... Oh yeah, sorry.
Okay, no problem. So you said that everything goes to the Thames River, so I would probably look for what kind of things are there, like dead animal bodies and other kind of stuff, and I would probably try to examine those things.
Absolutely. Critical point. Remember, your input for water, you're drinking water from Thames, and you're also dumping things in the Thames. So what is the water that you're really drinking, right? Absolutely critical. Test the water from the Thames. What kind of pathogens do you have there? Again, if you have today's resources. What else? I'll give you a clue. Shift the focus from the water. What else?
Maybe go look at the common symptoms that people are having.
Absolutely. This is crucial. First, to determine what is going wrong, you need some sort of symptoms. What is the pattern here, right? So your clues are diarrhea and so study the affected people. What is your cohort here, right? So that's another clue. Clue 1 is if you make a to-do list, first is definitely the source of water and where the water is going, test that water. Number 2 is the symptoms. The symptoms in a lot of cases will lead you towards disease. Absolutely crucial. What else?
Someone in the chat says test the areas heavily affected and see the common factors in these areas that might cause the disease.
This is another pattern recognition. So what they could do is probably they could test in other parts of England if they have the same kind of outbreak of disease at the same time. So remember, the time is important. What happened suddenly that 500 people died in those 10 days, right? This area was, what changed in those 10 days? This is one thing you have to, the timeline of the disease. How did the disease develop? What triggered the disease in those 10 days, right? The pump was there even before those 10 days. 500 people did not die then. What changed in that 10 days? That's a crucial question. So the timeline of a disease, of an outbreak, is absolutely crucial. All right. Anything else before we move to question 2? And if you think of something later, feel free to share it. So coming back to one of you suggested study the population. Question 2 is kind of related to studying the population. So John Snow did some or all of these things that we are discussing. He found certain discrepancies in the pattern of the patients, the people affected, or the deaths. So here is an ancient London map. Here is your pump, right? Here is Broad Street, and here is your Broad Street pump. And let me now give you what does not fall in place if this pump is the culprit. First of all, there is a coffee shop here, right by the pump, and there are 9 people sick. Not dead, but sick in this coffee shop. That seems kind of coherent, right? The coffee shop is near the pump and hence these people got sick. There's a workhouse near Soho, and here's the workhouse in this area. There are 53 people working in this 535 people working in this workhouse. None of them are sick. Does not add up. Brewery on Broad Street. Here is your brewery, very near the pump. And all workers are fine. Nobody is affected. Does not add up. Factory on Broad Street. Here, there is a factory here. 16 people are dead. Extremely concerning. And finally, there is an aunt and niece who live far away. They don't even live in Broad Street. They have the same symptoms and they have died. This is the 5, so I would say number 1 and number A and D are, you can explain it that, oh, they use the Broad Street pump, but what about B, C, and B, C, E, right? So these are your discrepancies. All right. Any comments, questions? What are your thoughts here? How are we explaining this? What sort of questions are we asking?
Maybe if it's by contact, because some people, even though they're living close by, they don't have it. But some people, if they came in contact with each other, then it might have. Not really sure.
But so that would mean that the workhouse and the brewery, is the brewery people? Okay, let me check. Yeah, brewery and workhouse did not come in contact with these people. What is the obvious question that, what is the obvious assumption here?
Are they sharing the same water pipe?
Sorry?
Are they sharing the same water pipe?
Absolutely. That is the big question here. You've actually put your finger on the issue. We are assuming that the Broad Street pump is, since all the major outbreaks have been near this pump, we are assuming that this pump is the culprit, right? this is something we have to dig deeper into. Is that true, or is that an assumption? Is it coincidental that this pump is just there? Or so that's your line of thought, right? And before I this obviously leads us to question 3: where did the contamination come from? What happened in the 10 days? So the pump was always there. What happened in these 10 days that kind of triggered or made the situation, aggravated the situation? So this is question 3. So if you follow newspapers of the era, the officials were, they were like, no way, sewage from the town pipes do not leak into this pump. So there is no way, there's something wrong with the pump, right? And John Snow too did a lot of investigation, and he wasn't sure whether it's open sewers, the drains, public pipes, cesspools, where is this contamination coming from? He just couldn't figure it out. All right, so these are the 3 things that we are looking at today. And so one by one, if we answer, what would you do if you were Jon Snow? I think we have satisfactorily answered that question. This is actually a map from that era, and the dots represent the deaths from cholera. So here are the pumps, and here's the Broad Street pump, and you can see that the deaths are kind of concentrated around this pump. And this is also this same kind of map, the red dots telling you about the disease. Well, I think we kind of answered question 1. What are the questions that you would seek? You would test the water if you have modern resources. You would question the people about symptoms. You would try to identify the timeline of the disease, etc. So I think answer 1 is good. Number 2, describing all these discrepancies. I think the thing Michelle said, that are they getting the water from the same source? Are we assuming it, or let's verify? So what Jon Snow did is go to these people and ask them that question, and here is what they replied. The workhouse, everybody is healthy. Remember that we are looking at B, everybody is healthy. The workhouse had their own well, and they also bought water from Grand Junction Waterworks. So they did not use the Broad Street pump. That's why they did not get sick. All right, so one thing explained. The brewery, just to go back, brewery, there are no cases of cholera. Everyone is fine. So what are these people doing? They drank their own liquor. What a fantastic way of avoiding an epidemic, right? Just make your own liquor. And they also had their own well. So they don't use the Broad Street pump. Factory, where a lot of people died, they actually store this water in 2 tubs, and they get the water from the Broad Street pump, and of course people have died, right? So that's how they get their water. And faraway aunt and niece, and this I find is really sad, is so the aunt previously lived in Soho and now she has moved away, but she somehow liked the taste of the water, and she had bottles of water delivered to her from Soho. And this is how, although she did not live in the area, she got sick. This is such a strange and unfortunate thing to happen, but that's how what they figured out. And where did the contamination come from? Of course, Jon Snow looked at the Broad Street pump, and that was thought to be the culprit. But for a long time, he could not figure out what triggered that outbreak in the 10 days, why there was that disease in the 10 days. So this is actually quite relevant to today. The public officials were, of course, in denial. And if you have been following the coronavirus, do you remember the first response a lot of government officials had against the disease? That it's nothing, right? It's nothing. But unfortunately, in the United States alone, 500,000 people, more than 500,000 people have died. And so denial is, in a lot of cases, the first response by authorities. So the public officials say nonsense, and the health report says that we see no reason to adopt this belief that the water was contaminated. These are just suggestions. Jon Snow doesn't know anything. And obviously it's fake science, right? However, Jon Snow was very persistent. He continued to track this cholera for months, and this tells you the value of perseverance when you're tracking diseases. You have to track it for months. However, he could track back a lot of the cholera to the Broad Street pump. For instance, there was a cabinet maker who had cholera who did not live in the area, but he passed through the area and he drank water from that pump, and he had the disease. Children going to school used the pump and they got the disease. So Jon Snow individually, he tracked these people, these different cohorts of people, and he traced back the disease to the Broad Street pump. And he did it for months. He was at it for months. And finally, he solved why this happened. So apparently the culprit was a woman who lived at 40 Broad Street, and she washed her baby's diapers in the Broad Street pump, and she dumped the waste in a cesspool which was 3 feet away. So do you see what's happening here? All the bacteria from the fecal matter of this baby kind of is contaminating the water source. It's just 3 feet away, so it's very near the water source, and this is what triggered the disease. Seems rather silly at this age, right? Like, why would you wash something like this near the water source? But remember, we are at an age where we just didn't have any idea about hygiene or what should and should not be done to a water source. So this was the mystery of the Broad Street pump. And just to end this section, later in 1883, Robert Koch, who was a German physician, he defined Snow's poison, which was Vibrio cholerae, and Vibrio cholerae is what causes cholera. It's and cholera epidemic since then been curbed in Europe and United States, when we now understand basic sanitation better than before, and so we know how to take care of our sewage, our water sources, city supply of water, etc. So this was how cholera was curbed, and today the World Health Organization estimates that 1.3 to 4 million people are affected, and it can cause up to 150,000 deaths. Safe water and sanitation is the key, and the basic treatment here is oral rehydration solution, or ORS. You might have seen this packet somewhere or not. So this has a lot of sodium chloride, potassium chloride, which kind of gives back ions into your body. And this is how oral rehydration salts is how we treat cholera today. And the WHO has this mission going on, ending cholera by 2030 in all parts of the globe. And of course, treatment these days is through antibiotics like doxycycline and ciprofloxacin, and so antibiotics are our main weapon against cholera. But so the problem was thought to be solved for a long time, until, what do you think happened? What's the problem with antibiotics? Or what's the emerging threat?
Like antibiotic resistance?
Absolutely. It's one of the biggest challenges that we are facing now, and we will face over the decades that are to come. Unfortunately, bacteria can also evolve to they have mechanisms to resist the effect of antibiotics, and this can be very, very severe in the future. We might be in an era where bacterial infections simply kill you because antibiotics no longer work, right? Before the discovery of penicillin, you could simply die of getting a cut on your foot because we didn't have anything to treat that kind of bacterial infection. A simple bacterial infection could kill you. and it is speculated that we might soon be back in that era where a simple bacterial infection is enough to kill you, because they are just super bacteria which are resistant to antibiotics. So this is the so we have historically traced one of the most what should I say, talked about cases of epidemiology from the 1850s in England, and we have traced how what are the steps that you need to take to track a disease, what are the questions you need to ask, what are the assumptions you need or need not make, and what is cholera, what is a disease like cholera in the current context. Any questions before we end? All right, thank you for listening. I hope I have impressed upon you how exciting it is to be an epidemiologist, and how this can be this can be a fantastic detective work. And I hope I have impressed upon you the spectrum of epidemiology, the wide range of things that fall under this one term, and all the things that you can do to study epidemiology. Thank you for having me as a speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Basu. That was a very fun presentation with all the detective work and Jon Snow appearance. So after this, we will be having a break, and then we will be joined by Dr. Willey for a presentation about medical admission, importance of minorities in medicine, and the evolution of medicine throughout the years. Thank you, Dr. Basu.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Be break time for the next 20 minutes, and then we'll have our next speaker join us.